Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to one of our final panels of the day. My name is Asha Sharma Anthony, and I'm the Managing Director at SID-Washington. SID-Washington's mission centers around convening diverse groups to debate the most critical and promising ideas that advance equitable development. So to highlight some of our community's best ideas, we launched the first ever SID-Washington Innovation Challenge this spring. Member individuals and organizations submitted entries that showed a development-focused and innovative application of simple technology. We specifically asked them to share how governments, donors, or implementing partners are providing better access to goods, services, or information, increasing outreach and engagement, or improving decision-making. We received several excellent entries showcasing truly thoughtful ideas, including a project that launched Jordan 360, Jordan's first virtual reality tourism site, a GIS tool that profiles 10,000 vulnerable communities in fragile African states, and many more. We ran the contest using HeroX, a platform similar to Kickstarter, where anyone can post their own competition, and our SID-Washington Annual Conference Committee members served as the selection committee. You're about to hear from our 5 winners, but we also encourage you to visit our site where we featured all of the entries. And now, I'm pleased to introduce Yaniv Snir, Director of Possibilities at HeroX, collaborator and supporter of this challenge, and this afternoon's moderator.
Thanks, Asha. So as Asha mentioned, my name is Yaniv, and I'm a Director of Possibilities with HeroX, which is a crowdsourcing platform that allows anyone to post a challenge, take a problem that you're facing and turn it into a competition and have the world help you solve it. The idea being that you can't have all the answers on the inside. There's somebody out there that has a solution that they can contribute. We did not have anything directly to do with the judging of any of the submissions, but I do want to congratulate all of you, and I had the pleasure of meeting everyone and reading about the work, and it truly is, it's really nice to see kind of these new technologies and new innovations and new methods and approaches in the field of international development being applied to emerging problems, but also to those old, stubborn, intractable ones like food insecurity and access to resources, education. So today what we're going to do is have an opportunity to hear from each of the winners of the challenge about what their projects are doing, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A conversation about how both the donors, the sponsoring organizations, as well as the implementing partners can sort of push one another to be more innovative. Not innovation and technology as an end in itself, but in the drive to find new solutions to these challenges. So with that, Robert, why don't we'll start with you, and then we'll just kind of move it down the line. And you can feel free to just do it from your seat.
Good afternoon. Yaniv said my name is Robert Anyang. I work for Chemonics International as the Agricultural Food Security Advisor. 2 months ago, I was the chief of party of a very exciting project in Uganda, which is the commodity production market activity, with the aim to transform the lives of 400,000 farmers in Uganda. Now, it was a simple task, but they say, make sure you work through intermediaries, that's middle actors, to able to deliver production and marketing services to small-scale farmers. We set out to find out what are the challenges small-scale farmers are facing. I'm sure most of you in the development world knows limited access to extension, limited access to inputs, limited access to finance, and a lot of other things that make the smallholder farmers not able to perform better. So let me tell you a little bit about the intermediaries we're supposed to work with. These are people called traders. I'm sure you've been in the donors world. The word traders means they're bad, they're coyotes. But now we are saying, let them work with farmers to transform the lives of the farmer. Very exciting, but very difficult. We spent half of the years of the program, first year, trying to build behavior change between traders and farmers, between service providers and traders, and also between the government of Uganda and the traders. Because the government of Uganda believe traders are bad people, they should be eliminated. Now, during one of our discussions between the service providers. When I say service providers of the value chain, I'm talking about banks, insurance companies, seed and other actors. We found that, yes, the traders can reach out to the farmers, but are they able to provide the service a normal extension worker will do? Are they able to deliver the services directly in an effective way? Most of the traders we're talking about are limited in terms of literacy. So we said, how do we solve that problem? Now, we start looking to ideas of, if we are going to deliver affordable services, which is the word cheap, and genuine down to farmers, what are the means we could use? Then we start with all the stakeholders and decide, let's find a solution that can cut the cost of transaction by 30% and also deliver the same effective and efficient services to small-scale farmers. With the support of USAID, FTF, a new company was born called Acorion. Acorion is a group of young 5 individual companies that come together to form the company. The word Acorion means farmer. Now, we thought everything was smooth. Now, I said in the beginning, traders are limited in terms of literacy. They know how to count their beans, but they don't understand how to use the app. So along the way, we developed different apps, try to test it. We keep on going back and forth until all this investment was USAID investment. And remember, nobody wants to fund a startup company anywhere in the world. No matter how good you are with ideas, if you don't have 2 years of experience, no money from you. So along the way, we keep on designing and changing, fine-tuning. We came with the word Easy Agric. Now, what does Easy Agric do? A farmer can sit in his village, go to the agent, and tell the agent, I want access to inputs. What he does is just put in the details, and that data is linked directly to the input suppliers who delivers the input down there at a cheaper cost of 30% lower. Why is it lower? Because input companies spend over 42% of their money in looking for customers and delivering inputs. Now, there's an app there that tells them, here's a buyer, you supply it. It was also efficient for the crop insurance. Farmers were also able to use the same app to access crop insurance. Market was good. Farmers were able to have market information. Now, in all these apps, you need to have a smartphone. Not all farmers in the village have smartphones. So what they need to do is work with agents who have smartphones, who becomes a link to them. And most of these agents have average of 1 to 200 farmers. Remember, everywhere, I can tell you about Uganda, the ratio of extension worker to farmers is 1 to 20,000. But with this app, the ratio dropped down to 1 to 200. Because all we need to do is develop user-friendly information on the app that all you need to do is just play it. Information like animations that shows how a farmer to plant. So, as all technology, you think everything will move fast? No. There's a call for learning, and that call of learning will find a lot of lessons that not everything moves faster as we thought. Now, for Acorion to reach out to many farmers, it needs to expand its business. And that means investing more in what we call a franchising agreement with different agents at the grassroots. So the more they try to invest more, that means the more that takes away the seed capital of the investment doing. USAID said, step in again, work with other donors like the United Nations Capital for Development Fund to make more mobile phone accessible at the rural area. We've learned a lot. This app has changed the lives of over 560,000 farmers in Uganda now, and it's easy to just pick the app, I have it on my phone, buy inputs, get extension services, and then things move easily, and farmers are grateful to it. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you, Robert. So if you guys have questions, just kind of note them down, and we'll circle back at the end once everyone's had an opportunity to present. So with that, Pauline.
Hello, everybody. My name is Pauline Gitao. I'm currently a computer science student at Syracuse University. I'll go once again. My name is Pauline Gitao. I'm a current computer science student at Syracuse University, and I'm here because of an innovation I'm part of called Beacon Inclusive. Like any other person who's trying to use tech to bridge communities, bridges in any other sector, we are trying to find a way where we are going to do something that's not just innovative, but that's going to be bridging a real gap and make a difference in other people's lives. over time, we've seen people talking about development, and we want to see people move from one point of life to another, but rarely do we think of how inclusive is that. Are we going to be moving with everybody? And if you've been following the whole SDG goals, there's the whole idea of we want to move, but you want to move with everybody. That's what Become Inclusive is doing. We have a communication app that currently focuses on the deaf community and those who are hard of hearing, trying to make sure that they don't have to go through many challenges in their access to healthcare. Healthcare is our first priority because we started this company with Alan, and you're both from Kenya, and in as much as our country tries to be very inclusive and trying to bring all these other requirements and facilities, infrastructure that's going to help everybody access whatever they want, we haven't actually done enough yet. So our being in this particular sector, we are trying to do our little thing, which might not be that little at the end of the day, because currently we have deaf people and hard of hearing who can use our platform to access healthcare. We've been talking about this one particular girl because she's been the one person we've seen we've made most significant difference in her life. We've said this over and over again, but I still say it. We have one girl who's called Atieno. Atieno is deaf, and she was trying to get a job in this health facility where she's offering sexual health, mentorship, and assistance, but nobody was going to hire her because there was that barrier for communication. But now Atieno is able to use our platform and actually work with other people. People can actually go to her and not have so many questions because they know I can still communicate with her no matter my own physical abilities. In other parts, we have people who are deaf who different places have different capabilities and infrastructural development. And although places here and also hospitals in the US, I've seen they try to be really considerate of inclusion and accessibility for every other person. But we've had cases where people have had to go to either a particular doctor or to a particular health facility, or you have to go with a person who can actually use sign language to help you out. But if access to healthcare is such an important issue as it is, we want people to be able to go and to access that without having to get a million other things to bring together for you to access whatever you want. So Beacon Chat is our first step towards doing these. But in future, please do look out, because the future is bright. You want to expand not just into communicating using an application, but just continuing to create let the society be as inclusive as it can get. And Become Inclusive, we are doing what everybody else is trying to do, make the future as inclusive for everyone. If you're going to be going forward, let us all go forward together. Yeah.
Thank you, Pauline.
Good afternoon. My name is Peter Levine. I'm with Apt Associates, and I think as some of you have noticed, I came with my formal wear today, my Indonesian batik, because what I want to talk to you about is Indonesia and a project that we did there. Indonesia, in many ways, has what we think of as a spatial problem. You have 80,000 villages, 17,000 very different islands, but very few have legally demarcated boundaries. Most estimates say about 5%. That causes a lot of problems, land disputes, conflicts between brothers and sisters, an uncertain investment environment, poor natural resources management. So what we did was to work with our clients and our stakeholders to develop an integrated approach, one which blended tradition, technology, and the law for long-term impact and local ownership. So it's really, I think of this approach as the appropriate technology we're talking about here, and it was developed and tested over 900,000 acres of villages under the MCC Compact with Indonesia. So we're very proud to share that work. So in order to address that problem, what we did was to work with over 10,000 village representatives on a very complicated 21-step boundary setting process. And that linked participatory planning at the village level, which you have to do in Indonesia, technology, GIS, GPS surveys, satellite imagery, the use of drones. You may have noticed a drone out at our booth out in the atrium there. in a rapidly changing legal framework. I mean, the law changed underneath our feet as we were implementing. I'm sure many in the room have seen that, right? The challenges that presents. So I'm not going to step through every 21 step here, but I am going to do a short talk at the booth afterwards, so people who want more details, I'm happy to get into it. But let me just highlight a few things that we did do that made this work. So we empowered these communities. We helped them to identify the boundaries, to document their oral histories, because that's what drives boundaries in many ways in Indonesia, to settle the disputes and to do the mapping with us. So this was never for them, but always with them. Sort of on-the-job training. I was talking to Pauline, and she said, well, you taught them how to fly the drones? And yes, we did. They flew the drones as we taught them. We did the more sophisticated work, but we always engaged them in that process. They would validate the satellite maps based on their own knowledge. They built the boundary pillars. At the end of the day, we had to put physical boundary pillars to denote the boundaries of the villages. And they now own the data. We integrated these community members. So we formed very diverse village participatory teams in each location, and they worked jointly with our app teams who lived in those locations for months at a time. So these groups brought youth, women, vulnerable groups, indigenous communities, and village leaders together at each step of the process, so that really, again, the technology worked with and for the full range of community stakeholders. And again, I said it before, but we combined technology and tradition. So we went from the bottom up and the top down. As the village teams worked to build consensus, to resolve disputes and engage the stakeholders, the drones flew to identify natural and cultural resources, to show where the river was. And I mean, the smiles on the faces of the children in these villages who love the idea of people showing up with essentially toy airplanes really got us some extra value from the village elders and the people, right? We did 5-centimeter accurate GPS surveys. These were conducted to guide where to put the boundary pillars. And we then processed final maps for accuracy and sustainability. So let's be clear. Traditional oral histories are important and part of most societies around the world, from the US to Nigeria to Indonesia to everywhere. But natural landmarks are changing. Rivers change, waterfalls move, new things are built. So combining that history with technology really provides some permanence for today and tomorrow. So, I mean, this approach worked, and Yaniv asked us to think a little bit about what worked and what didn't. So the approach worked. In our last set of locations alone, 98% of our borders were agreed to, our boundary segments were agreed to, and over 2,000 critical cultural and natural resources documented. And the technology was a tool for impact, not just for its own sake, something we were discussing before as a group, right, the importance of that. But villagers could see the drones fly and see the results. So when they looked at the maps, it wasn't just someone coming in from Jakarta saying, look, here's a map and these are your boundaries. They could say, oh, we just saw this fly. I can see where the mosque is, where the government building is, and match that. So it really had that extra impact. Now, I should be clear with these projects, not everything worked. I mean, our first set of locations that we operated in, the process of collecting and reviewing thousands of documents which back up the final legal decree, we left until very late in the activity. That created a lot of problems. Confusion, extra work. These projects were done under a very tight time frame. But to be honest, we learned from that. In the last set of locations, we put in place a dual language document workflow management system, off-the-shelf software, customized for this. But that allowed us to track at every step and compile the documents at every step. So I mean, I think some of technology is a continuous learning process. So let me just stop with a few numbers so you have a sense of the scope of this program, and there's more material out of the booth. We worked in 12 districts. We worked in 23 sub-districts. We legalized village boundaries covering, I have to read this number exactly, 941,636 acres. We work with community leaders in over 280 villages and produced over 800 maps and resolved dozens of disputes. And to me, a sign of the sustainability potentially and the impact and the way this innovation, if you will, and that's a word that's perhaps used a little too freely, but this innovation, if you will, worked is that our client afterwards, an Indonesian, told us that he expects that in the provinces that we worked, that those provinces are going to take the methodology and the approach and use it to do village boundaries for all of their villages within the next 5 years. Now, I'll admit, I'd like to go back in 5 years and see if that statement was true, but I like to hope so. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. Now I understand what my role is. In every marathon, there has to be a rabbit. I guess I'm the rabbit here, right? My background is purely from the private sector, right? So I'm going to speak to you about the work that my company does. There are two interests here, so my existence is dichotomized. I run a development firm in Nigeria, and we have a partnership here. The Ron is my business partner who's sitting here, and I'll talk a little bit about how we manage those two roles. So my background, I am an engineer. I build factories, I design and build plants, and over the past 20 years, the firm in Nigeria, which is called Aquada Development Corporation, we've built a factory. If you've been to West Africa, you know that gari is a staple food made from cassava. We've processed gari into a flour which is sold here for gluten-free flour. We've made a whole bunch of things. We have a rice mill which is really not intended to produce rice. It's intended to produce rice husk, which powers our facility. We just happen to sell rice on the side. But what we entered into the contest, and by we I mean our partnership here, is a product we call fish farm in a box. And fish farm in a box is literally what it is. It's a box which we ship to your home, and if you unpack it, in a few hours you have a fish farm in the back of your house. And why would we focus on putting fish farms in the backs of people's homes? Because if you look at where the development in aquaculture in West Africa, which is our primary market, is, it's in business, it's in people who want to, entrepreneurs who want to enter into aquaculture as a secondary occupation, right? They're either working somewhere and they want to develop a side business. So if we ship this box to you, it's called fish farm in a box, you unpack it, you unfurl it, you set it up together. What you have at the end of 2 or 3 hours is a fish farm. You don't have the fish in there yet, but we'll ship that once the fish farm is set up. But you may ask, well, what kind of business is that? Our real business is not the fish farm in a box. Our real business is fish feed, floating fish feed. In the same way that HP's business is not printers, it's ink, right? And what we're hoping to do is that if you buy a fish farm in a box, we supply you the fish feed, which is the single most important contributor to the cost of production of fish. If you're familiar with what's happening in most of the African, I'd say most of the sub-Saharan subcontinent, fish feed is imported, which I think is just a mad idea, right? I mean, if you look at everything that you need to produce fish feed, it grows on the continent, but most of the fish feed that is used in Nigeria is imported, comes from the port of Rotterdam, which I think is just crazy. So a few years ago, we set about to solve this problem. And we've developed a floating fish feed. I keep emphasizing the word floating because that word is important. Catfish is the most dominant species of fish that people grow. It's hardy, it's easy to maintain. And if you don't have floating fish feed, what tends to happen is that you feed the fish, most of it sinks, and that feed is essentially wasted and it fouls up your water. So you want feed that will float. It's a difficult engineering problem to solve, and we've been able to solve it. Now, if you think about, let's imagine somebody who works for the government, right? So imagine a civil servant who wants to set up a fish farm in their home. What they would do before us would be, well, you go and set up a concrete pond, right? You set up a concrete pond, it's permanent or semi-permanent. What we've been able to do is to develop this model where the fish farm is scalable, right? So as you grow your stock of fish, you just buy more units from us and you can grow your fish. Or as you sort them out as your fish grows. Now, the problem is not getting the fish farm into the homes. There's a knowledge gap, right? So think of, I work in the civil service. I'm a director of something, and I have a fish farm in my home. You need to tell me how to manage my fish well. And the word technology, I don't like that word a lot. I'm a chemical engineer, and I think these computer guys have stolen this word from us. So technology means something that has a battery, but I'll deign to them on this occasion. What we did was we developed this simple application, and which we provide you with a tablet. I don't think that's an accomplishment. I don't. But what we realized was that if we put this tablet in people's hands and they don't have power, it's a waste of time. So we developed this power bank and a portable solar panel so that wherever you are, suddenly you can keep records of your stock of fish. Now, here's the trick. We said, okay, we'll provide you with support for a year, right? So as you're collecting this data on your phone, you're sending it back to us, right? And it's enabled us to create a new class of entrepreneurs who are able to learn together and grow together. Now, where are the problems? And the problems are the usual problems of transportation. No matter how well you produce the fish feed, you still have to truck it to the villages, you still have to get it to people. But as we often find, the market teaches us something. And what we learned quickly once we started this was that people said, no. Don't ship me one. We're going to form a group, a community, right? So we're going to get together, 4, 5, or 6 of us are going to buy a larger set. So we begin to form these micro communities of aquaculture entrepreneurs who are self-supporting. We didn't see that coming. We're not that smart. My business partner would. He's worked for USAID for a long time. That sort of thing doesn't come to my brain, but he gets it, I don't. But what we had was people coming together in groups and learning. So suddenly the training that we were providing them was being done in groups. So instead of having 5 people with 5 different tablets in 5 homes, 5 of them to get together in one home, and we could train them that way. Now, where have we failed? We failed, and I use the word fail, meaning that's the next problem that we're going to solve. That's how I use that term. Failure is temporal. The usual problems that you find in enterprise development in Africa apply here, right? The fish farm in a box costs a certain amount of money. Coming up with that money can be difficult for some people, not a lot, but if you want it to propagate to all the places you would like it to, this is where somebody's money needs to come in. We have very good relationships with the banks, and we're working with the banks to provide financing to people who can, but you know that access to credit is traditionally a problem. No matter what you do, no matter how viable the project might be. Now, for us, it comes back to a technical problem at the end of the day. And I say this only because I'm a silly engineer. I don't understand human beings are complicated, right? Get human beings out, let's solve the problems. So I'll tell you the problem that we're having today. And for me, this is where the innovation comes in. Yaniv was talking about innovation. And I thought about it and I said, our tagline at Aquata is innovation for living. It's been that way for 20 years. So innovation must mean something to us. But here's the problem that we have. We can't get enough worms into our factory. We need worms. Now, if you think about, I don't know about you, but if you go to most African villages, worms are a nuisance. Nobody thinks about worms and thinks about them as an economic opportunity. But vermicomposting is something that we've started as a company, so we can grow worms to provide the protein input that we need into our feed. Now, what most people do is that they go and catch fish and they kill the fish to feed fish. We think that's a crazy idea. Most of our feed is plant-based, the protein is plant-based, but we would like to get some worms. This is the kind of problem that I think partnering with development agencies and public sector entities could solve, right? Could we get a new class of entrepreneurs who would begin to grow worms on a commercial basis, given that we can guarantee offtake? We can guarantee that we would buy it, right? These kinds of relationships, these kinds of partnerships are the things that I think provide the fulcrum for the innovation that you would like to see. And if you know somebody who is interested in growing worms or in enabling people to grow worms, have them come and see me. Thank you.
Thank you, Emeka.
Hello. I'm Kevin Wheeler with the Kaizen Company, and I'm really happy to be up here because Kaizen's purpose for being is to come up with innovative approaches to development and test them out in emerging markets. So when we had the opportunity to participate in this panel, it was a great excitement for us. So the model I'd like to share with you guys today is what we hope is an innovative education model, which is also very, very, very simple and potentially very, very impactful. So the development challenge that we are facing is access to education in rural areas, places that are not well served by national education systems. So specifically, we're working in rural Liberia, where in Bong County, in the city of Banga, where enrollment rates, best case, are 50% in schools, and probably in most cases are much, much lower. Now, things are much worse for girls who become pregnant when they're in school, because for one reason or another, they are basically forced to leave school. They fall behind in their studies. They find it very, very hard to return to school once they've finished their pregnancy and early motherhood. And as a result, they really find themselves pushed into a cycle of poverty. It's a very common story, not just in Liberia, just everywhere. So what Kaizen's Learning Links approach is doing, what we're seizing on, is actually a silver lining on this pretty bleak background. And that silver lining is, even though literacy is very, very, very low in rural Liberia, there actually are literate and numerate women. Actually, 1 in 5, or maybe even a little higher than that, are actually solidly numerate and literate. So what Learning Links is doing is, what we want to do is, these women are a really exciting pool of really underutilized human capacity that we can channel into providing literacy and numeracy teaching, education services to kids who are not being served by the national education system. So what Learning Links does is we use a technology platform, financial-based set of incentives and support to enable literate and numerate women to really become freelance tutors for out-of-school girls. So how do we do this? Well, really, like nuts and bolts. We recruit literate and numerate women in local communities. We match them with girls who've had to leave school. We provide them the Liberian alternative basic education curriculum, and the women and girls meet together 3 to 5 times a week in locations and times that they choose. And what Learning Links does is we send every day to these learning girls, we send SMS quizzes just on simple feature phones that are linked. These quiz questions are linked to where they are in the curriculum. And when a girl answers those questions correctly, she gets a micropayment. And also, her tutor gets a micropayment. So it's this incentive structure which is aligned between the tutors and the girls to provide these education services. Now, what I just described to you is an oversimplification of actually how we implement it, because in the nuts and bolts there, I'm sure many of you can see some questions that we've had to overcome there. But the results that we've had so far are really encouraging. We've been going for about a year. We support 300 girls right now. We'll be ramping up to 2,500 at the end of this year. They are learning. Both they're learning to read better and learning math better. Our attrition rate is very, very low, and the interest in the program is much greater than anything that we can accommodate. So this is a very small pilot project for this, tapping into this underutilized human capacity for education, but its implications are much, much bigger than just in Banga. So across Liberia, there are over 1 million kids who are underserved by the national education system and live in communities and where there 1 in 5 women are literate and numerate. So this model could replicate across Liberia. And also, many places in the world where there's underservice by the national education system, and there are literate adults who are not who could be brought to serve as informal or freelance tutors using this model. So, and looking at it from really the bigger perspective is that this idea of tapping into underutilized human capacity is a really common, proven, exciting idea, which is taken flight over the whole world. All we need to do is look at the ride-hailing apps like Lyft and Uber, and then all of the more regional ones across the world, to see that human capacity in the world wants to be connected to work, and technology and incentive structures can really be a great way to do that. So what we're seeing now in Banga is just the tip of the iceberg, we hope, in terms of for how to apply this to education.
Awesome. Thank you all. these are the challenges, and then your solutions to addressing those all have, some avenue of innovation, introducing technologies and new approaches to solving these challenges. And what they all have in common too is a certain level of risk, right? Whether it's the funding organizations or the implementers. There is some level of risk, and Emeka, you mentioned that failure is an opportunity for a new problem to be solved. That's great, and it's very true in the private sector. In the public sector, there's definitely the tolerance for risk is much lower. So my question is to all of you, and I open up to the audience as well, is we've heard over the last 15, 20 years about the government and various donor organizations wanting to introduce innovation, and they're looking for an innovative approach to solving ... When you look on the ground at what's actually and then of course, the implementing partners write proposals that are beautiful and they talk about these innovations, but if you go and look, you won't really see too much of a difference in how things are getting done. These may be outliers. I mean, there's not many programs that are using drone technology, for instance. But the question then is, what is the responsibility that both the funders have as well as the implementers have in pushing one another to actually implement innovative approaches, right, using new technologies or emerging technologies, not so that there's cool-looking programs on the ground, but that are actually able to reach more people, to do things much more cost-effectively, even in the home office project management side, streamlining processes, using new technologies and approaches to project management, for instance, and using savings to procure more goods and services for the development projects. The question is, again, where does the responsibility or where's that onus to kind of make sure that the most innovative, new, kind of front of the line approaches are actually being used for the benefit of the international development sector?
I can take a first crack at that to get us started. As you mentioned earlier, Yaniv, it really comes down to risk and the different risk profiles of the funders and of the implementers. And it doesn't matter if it's a donor or a foundation or whatever, and the implementer, it could be an NGO or a business, but they have very different risk profiles. So the funders being more risk averse, and then the implementers really being able to take more risks. And something that has really helped us a lot wrestle with this is really trying to understand the funder's perspective, and that they really it's hard for them to take on risk. So the way that we've designed some of our approaches is to integrate in innovation, but also have elements of the project that are guaranteed to deliver something. So it's a little bit of having your cake and eat it too. But then, from the funder's standpoint, we've definitely seen, particularly with many donors over the last 5 years, a lot more real genuine interest and understanding about how to manage risk, and understanding that to do innovation, there is more risk that's required. So it's a little bit of I think the responsibility for both groups is to come together a little bit more, which is a trend that we see happening.
So just looking for space, where there is space in the contract or in the agreement to introduce something that's maybe not the entire program, but they're going to see the results that they want to see, and they're trying out something new.
Yes.
And is that something that you all have found is relatively easy to do?
No.
From the contractor side or from the
possible.
government side?
Both.
I mean, there's a component here which we shouldn't lose sight of, and again, my take on this is skewed by my perspective on it. I have fired people for not taking a risk. I've dismissed them, right? For not trying, right? I've never dismissed anybody for failing, because you never fail, right? We just learned it. Next time we go back, we're better at it, right? But the problem is that I can do that because there's a commitment that we have as a company to that sort of work, right? I'm not sure that you can make that kind of commitment with taxpayer funds, right? I don't know how far you can go with taxpayer funds to do that sort of thing. Like when I said it in jest, we built a rice mill not because we love rice, but because we wanted the husk, right? And we got the rice husk to gasify that husk for power. And if you worked in Nigeria, power is a problem everywhere. We're an energy independent firm because we generate our own power. The more rice we mill, the more rice husk we have. And if you come to our facility, there's not an ounce of rice husk because we consume all that, right? But the first time we attempted that, it didn't work, right? And the guy who was leading that project said, well, why don't we just negotiate better rates for diesel? Right? Which is a logical proposal, right? Well, let's just see what we can do with diesel. And I told him he had 14 days to deliver a gasifier that worked, and he did in 8 days. But I'm not sure that if I were running a program for USAID or DFID or whoever, that I would have that much room, because the funnel tightens as you go down, right? And so the answer may be in looking for ways in which public sector funds, which have to be accounted for and restricted largely, right, could partner with private sector funds or funding that have a little bit more elbow room to create something that either one couldn't do. Like for me, I mean, I talked about worms. I don't want to go and build an outgrower scheme for worm growers. That's not a problem that I want to solve. I don't want to do that. I just want worms, right? I don't. But then we may be open to partnering with somebody who says, let's go develop these worm growers, and you guarantee the offtake of the worms, right? And I think that's where you can get the best of both worlds. But I think if you're asking for a funder to take on that amount of risk, I'm not sure that is going to, I'm not sure that they even could.
Yeah, please, there's a mic.
Well, it all depends on the problem, right? The problem that you're trying to solve and how bad the problem is. So if it's a question of, no offense to your business here, but if it's about worms, it will not have the same amount of energy coming from a potential funder than if it's a problem of some kind of a disease, let's say. That's an epidemic that's starting up, right? As an analogy, I'm just thinking out aloud here. So it all depends on the problem on the ground that you're trying to solve, how badly it needs to be solved, and what are the consequences or ramifications of not solving it, right? And that, so there are 3-4 components to it. One is somebody who collects data from the ground and articulates it in a manner that puts requirements together. Then the second component is like a delivery organization on the ground that takes that requirements to a funder and find a particular technology partner if technology is ready to solve it. So I think it all depends on the problem on the ground, and that will drive the funder to invest more or less into it.
Yeah, although I think that it may depend on the problem. That's definitely possible. I think it's the kind of that, I do think it all boils down to the level of risk, regardless of what problem it is. If there's a problem that the government or that any funding organization is looking to solve, what is their level, regardless of the problem, what is their risk tolerance? And are they willing to give the implementing partner kind of the leverage and the leeway to try something that hasn't been tried before? To bring in an innovative approach, to bring in new partners that don't have previous experience working with the government, there's definitely lip service paid to that. And what I would love for us to really dig into is how do we make that happen? And is it where does that coming together happen? Is it from the government side, or is it the implementing partners pushing the government and trying to bring in new approaches, and like Kevin said, trying to create that space within the project to try these new approaches?
I'm a little confused. When you say government,
So I just mean
any stakeholder.
I just mean whoever's paying for the project.
Whoever is paying for the project. Again, in my mind at least, it depends on the problem, how severe the problem is. And different stakeholders, different funders have different capacities to take risk. So if it's really having an impact on the ground, say for instance, if the consequence of inaction are grave, the potential of the donor who is invested in that solution, the chances are higher that they will take higher risks. It's a subjective situation.
Yeah.
There's no
Yeah, Yaniv,
Let-
if I might,
sorry.
I mean, sorry, I think the answer is partly it's a shared responsibility for this, and it depends. In the Indonesia project, to a degree, they said this is our challenge. There's some risk involved. You know, there's an old game show, I can name that tune in how many notes, right? In this case, they said to us, how many notes can you name that tune in? And we said, we can do it in this period, in this environment. So I think there's a mutual obligation. My observation in the last 5 years or so is there certainly is more appetite for risk and innovation, and I think our colleague is right. The more challenging global pandemics and things like that maybe promote a greater appetite for that mutually. And I know I have some colleagues in here and around that work on the health side of the business, and they've seen that as we've worked, for example, on airborne infectious diseases, that the willingness to look at more innovative approaches, more risky approaches. Well, I'm not sure that innovation and risk are necessarily the same thing, right? I mean, there's elements of that. If you hear the diversity of things that we've talked about here, some of these are innovations and some are not so risky. So, I mean, I think it's sort of a shared responsibility. And some of that is, it's a people business, right? Knowing who it is. I mean, in the case of Indonesia, the folks at MCC, I wouldn't say they were risk tolerant, but they were looking to push the envelope a little bit on technological solutions and asked us to join them in that process. And then they worked very collaboratively with us every step of the way. So in some ways, it does depend on the challenge, the client, the business, things like that. So, I mean, it's not an either-or proposition to a degree.
Let me just chip in my experience about working with my project was a USAID-funded project implemented by Chemonics. And, you know, in 2014, the word CLA came out from everywhere, right from Washington down to Uganda. And they said, you guys have a room to try, fail, and try, and fail. So we found there's a need to bridge extension services, there's a need, and we have to go the way by forming a company all under USAID funds. So I started with the mission director and said, listen, we need to invest. If it fails, we call it a CLA. If it works, we must find a way of the private sector taking lead. And they agree. I'm surprised to see some mission. The mission, I think I love the mission in Uganda. They're always willing to try something new. And that means you must have somebody in within the mission that's saying, let's take a risk. It's our fund, it's taxpayers' money, but we see if it works well, we're able to solve issue of employment, youth, we're able to deliver service to farmers, which he said is a problem. If we're able to get the farmers to access production and marketing services, then it's fine. That was 2 years ago. We also need to have an exit strategy. When do we stop funding it? So our exit strategy was to say, if it doesn't work in 2 years, we'll walk away from this. Do you know it worked in 2 years? Last month, Kali and Salt, a company based in Germany, paid 15% for the shares of Acorion, about $1.6 million, just to start. Well, Kali and Salt wants to expand Acorion to Congo, to Rwanda, and Kenya. If it doesn't work, it will not stay. And they see the need. So that means donors must take the risk of first investing, and then the private sector will say, oh, let's chip in. And that's, I believe, the risk is bought.
Just creating those opportunities to sort of spread, to spread the risk by bringing in additional players?
Yes, spread the risk, but players like private sector wants to see it working before they put their money in. Nobody likes to throw money like charity organizations. That's the roles of government and donors to try to do that, buy down on the risk, prove a concept is there, commercialize it, and let's move. There will always be donors.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you guys, and as well as you in the audience, what is some advice that you might give to your colleagues here? And we can all say that we're colleagues. You know, when you're looking for ways to sort of maybe push the boundaries of what is. Let me back up a little bit. The requirements of a contract or an agreement are, you know, they can be pretty strict, and there's things that you can do, but they're in this box. But there are seen, you know, and we've heard some today, and I'm sure you're all familiar with other projects that have been able to sort of push those boundaries a bit and introduce things that maybe the donor, or whether that's the government or another party, didn't necessarily think was going to be part of that project. How have you been able to do that? And what advice would you give the folks here? Hog it. You're the only one.
I think from our perspective, we are a delivery organization on the ground. The important thing is doing the due diligence. If you collect the right data and you do the due diligence of a problem and go to the root cause of the problem and have a solution that addresses the root cause, that goes a long way for you to present a case, because people are smart, people are intelligent, people can see through something that's really thought through or something that is a pie in the sky, right? So it's very important to do the due diligence, go to the root cause of the problem, build a solution that a potential funder can see in very simple words. That's how we've been trying to do as we have evolved our process on the ground and procedure on the ground. Planning is the most important thing, collecting the data, making sure the return of investment is significant enough for the donors to invest in the project. So that is, to me, the most important piece of this.
Okay, so just doing the due diligence. Please. You guys don't have to raise your hands, just walk up to the mic if you have anything to share, or if you have any questions for any of these folks about the projects that they shared with us.
Hello, I want to share one of my experience. I was working at USAID in country Georgia, and we had in my country the situation when the voters list were always like problems, and there were always concerns by politicians. And as gentleman mentioned, we went into the cause of the issue. So what's the cause of the issue? Why people are complaining? Why political parties are complaining? And the issue there was that addresses of the properties where people live are not properly described in the voters list. So we went down to that, and then we implemented a project which linked properties to people, and we called it addressing project. And that was a huge activity, but first thing was that we started with pilot, and that was very good idea, because we started with pilot and we invested around 200,000, and the pilot showed that the approach we were using was incorrect, and we failed. But we learned from that, and the second project, when we implemented around the city, then was built on a proper methodology and proper technology and everything, and we involved, and the major failure was that we involved citizens registration agency, but we did not involve so heavily property registration. And then we combined and shifted the roles, because we understand that both need to be involved. And so my advice will be that it's very important to have person inside the donor organization, because I was inside the donor organization and I understood the problem. And then I was doing, and there were a group of people, and we implemented like round tables and discussions, and everyone was on the same page. And when you go down and understand the problems, and then you convince, and you have like proof and evidence and everything, then it's very easy, because then you see that, okay, we have the issue, we have the problem, these are issues, and this is our like approach. And then we had the risk, and as I mentioned, we failed, but now the system works perfectly, and it's ownership by the government, and they're working, and they expanded after that in all other cities, and they named streets, and so every street has its own name, and so it's working. But I think it's initiative and this kind of linkage inside the agency. It's very important.
Yeah, and it boils down to, again, it's that communication, right?
Yes.
So is that something that you here on the panel found? Did you have a partner within the donor organization that you worked with closely to make sure that they were on board the entire time, that they understand what's happening, that if there's a new approach or a new way of doing something, that they were sort of on board with that and understood the potential and the use cases? And
I mean, in our case, we did. We had a partner that was very engaged, and there was the effort on land use planning was tied to a broader series of investments that they were planning to make. So they were with us from start to finish, which was helpful. I mean, I think your question about how do you get these sort of risks or innovations into projects, what's advice you can give, it sort of depends on where you're coming from. Amika is running a business, right? Now his business is designed to, in some ways, the fish farm, Fish in a Box, is designed to resolve a real development challenge. I mean, I remember the only trip I've ever made to South Sudan, there was one farmer who was clearly the most successful of them all, and one of the things he had that nobody else had was a fish farm. And I was impressed. It was in the middle of nowhere. right? But everybody else wanted to do what he did. So I think the advice I would give, and frankly, it's common sense to a degree, right, is sort of, catalog and analyze your risks, right? You may have business risks, right? What is your company's appetite for risk in implementing a short-term intensive project with a hard end date? And that was what we had. And this was a discussion we had inside APT. What are your contract risks, to your point? And some of these contracts are very restrictive, right? So some may be appropriate for some sort of push in the envelope, and others may be less. And you have to be realistic. And your technical risks, right? I mean, that's something there. And then your solution should be designed on those three levels according to that. And I think, and it's easy to say sitting up here, but as Amika said, don't be afraid to fail. I mean, this is the sorts of things we're talking about, helping people with disabilities, solving challenges for farmers, learning in Liberia. It's hard, right? And I mean, if you're succeeding 100% of the time, something's not right. I mean, I certainly think that. And if you go, there's an annual fail fest that a guy named YN Vota puts on, and it's a discussion. Everybody comes together because I think you can learn a lot about it. One of the beauties of these sorts of systems, right, is that you fail, you burn it down, but you start over again. So, I mean, I think that's where some of it comes from. That's the advice I would give, and I think people should push the envelope for these types of solutions.
I mean, just to add to that, I mean, some of these things are cultural, and I think we tend to underestimate the impact of culture on behavior, right? Ron and I are business partners, but when we first met, he was working for USAID and I was running a business then, and he went to a trade show in Abuja and he saw a product and he said to my assistant, well, I like this product. Where did it come from? And my assistant, who wasn't lacking in confidence, said, well, when you get to Washington, talk to my boss. That was her way of letting him know that he wasn't the only one who had access to airplanes to get to DC. Anyway, the issue there was that I couldn't get enough cassava to process, right? I had a facility that could do 50 metric tons of cassava a day. If I got 3 tons a day, it was a good day. Now, what we ended up doing was we said, okay, let's go out, let's form a cooperative. And we're going to provide support to farmers to grow cassava for us. Now, I want you to see how far I've come from worrying about pumps and pipes to forming a cooperative and dealing with things that I think other companies at the time were better positioned to deal with. But this was a matter of survival for us. What happened in the end was that as this project grew, in 6 months we had about 4,000 farmers. So there was a need. We then said, okay, these farmers are not just going to grow cassava for us, they need to be entrepreneurs as well. And so we partnered with a number of agencies, and what we started doing was training them to use the cassava that they were growing anyway to make all kinds of new things. So they were beginning to spurn out new enterprises, right? The risk for us is that we stretch too far and we become all things to all people. That's not what we want to do, right? But I come back to this issue of working your core competencies, right? We knew that we could go to villages and teach them things with cassava that they hadn't thought about, right? But the program management and sort of all the other things that a lot of people here do very well are not things that we could do or should do. And so in managing risk, one way to do it is to spread it, right? And by spreading it, it means finding people who can bring relevant competencies so everybody buys down the overall risk by taking on the areas where they're strongest. That program was a very successful one. I mean, it got us all the cassava that we wanted, and all we had to do was just to say we'll give them stems, and at the end of the planting season, they had to give it back to us. And so this was a way that enabled us to replicate stems. But, these are problems that I think can be solved. I mean, a problem shared is a problem halved, right? I think looking more towards forming these kinds of working partnerships, durable partnerships, I think is a way to make a lot of things work. But there's work in forming them, and I don't know if the will to form them is there, but where they form, I think they work quite well.
Thank you. Kevin?
Sure. My question to the panelists is, maybe you have some thoughts about going from the innovation level to diffusion of technology and scalability, especially when you're talking about one-on-one teaching. What are some thoughts about how this might go to scale? While you're thinking about that, I just thought I'd add that once these technologies start talking to each other and working together, we're really going to see something, because I think what's going to happen is Peter's drones are going to be taking Amika's fish farm in a box to pregnant women who are going to be turned into fish farmers, with thanks to Robert's people who go out and do the training and also deliver the worms out there to solve that problem. And we're also going to include deaf people who can't actually, who can communicate and involve other handicapped people to be able to be successful fish farmers with all these technologies. So thank you very much. The question goes back to you.
Working yourselves out of a job, sounds like. Would anyone like to? Go ahead.
Yeah, I can take a quick crack at the going to scale. For us, when we're thinking about that, there are really three elements. I mean, we want to lower the costs of what we're doing, marginal cost of each additional person who's learning. Two is we want to really learn what we are doing so well that we can replicate it. We can put a how-to guide that we can train any number of people to do it, rather than us having to be doing it by ourselves. We need to turn it into a recipe. And the third source, which is in a lot of ways the hardest, but is also fundamentally important, is finding a way for it to generate income on its own, for it to be able to scale. Because we're not going to be able to, at least from our perspective, donor funding can help us scale greatly, but it won't help us grow as quickly and spread the idea as quickly as we would like, compared to being able to generate income in our own process. So we're looking at a variety of different business models there, including like a freemium model, and then sorts of sponsorships and stuff like that. But really, those three things. So lower the cost, make it as copy-pastable as possible, and get it to generate income. And those three things will really help us scale. And then I'm sure there'll be a whole host of other challenges beyond those first hills.
So I think, like, to answer your question, like, when he's saying like about copy and pasting the idea, like just as he was talking, I was thinking of how I can copy and paste his model in my own country, Kenya, in a way that is just not going to be free, but in a way that you could actually get revenue from whatever you're doing. I think like the more we talk about what you're doing, we actually get ways to implement it further. For Beacon Inclusive, the company is still like very young, so we still have like that whole opportunity to venture into institutions that actually need these, instead of actually just working with a person who we are giving the services. We are looking at partnering with health institutions and potentially the government too, because Kenya is just opening up to using technology for inclusivity and accessibility. So just partnering with other institutions, getting the funding, and again replicating the same model in other sectors, education, transport, because it's the same thing can be used in definitely like almost everything else.
Thank you. And I just want to give Human an
Thank you. Well, thanks to all of you. Very interesting. I have follow-up questions after this. But two specific ones. One for Peter. What was the relative advantage of using drones to something like Google Earth and justifying the project? And the other one for Kevin. You mentioned pregnant girls. The immediate thought that comes to my mind is child laborers. How would you go about adapting that to them?
Okay. I mean, the truth is that given the degree of accuracy that we needed to have to complete this boundary setting activity based on the requirements of Indonesian law, Google Earth type solutions were never an option for us. We did look at things like Digital Globe and other big providers of satellite imagery. And in fact, we did at the end of they have to purchase some of our satellite imagery to develop some of the maps. In terms of the drones, I mean, what they do is a couple of things. They're basically complementary in some ways. So they allowed you, in the case of the mapping of critical cultural and natural resources, to do those over very difficult and diverse terrain. If you mapped them out properly, you could really identify them. But then the secondary piece of that is they allowed you to make that real and concrete for the villagers, basically, because they saw you flying these drones. then the footage that you generated was real time, basically. You were able to come down there, use that footage to complement the satellite imagery, and so it provided additional buy-in, again, so that they didn't just think this is somebody from the capital city coming here and saying these are our boundaries, when, we know what our boundaries are. They saw the maps, and then they saw the drones fly, and that additional sort of confidence building helped. And I think you're seeing some of that in terms of how things get to scale. You're seeing some recognition of this, to Kevin's question, in the way different people are approaching that challenge in Indonesia. I mean, the country has a goal of mapping all of its villages, but the numbers are expanding. And the World Bank has funded a lot of programs around one map, which is a very top-down solution. But they've recognized that that's not going to get them what they need. They need sort of a one map down, which will use those the Google Earth type technologies, and sort of a PMAP up solution. But I mean, the challenge on scale there, as Pauline said, and as Kevin said, it's a cost one. I mean, these are not necessarily cheap solutions. I don't remember what our final numbers were, but I think they were, what we did was probably about $10,000 a village. And if you think, add it up, right, 80,000 villages. It's a lot of money to implement that. But as you implement, as people learn it, different villages cost less, so there's some element of learning where you can scale up and down the solution itself. That's how you can get to scale. But the UAVs, in some ways, the drones were very complementary, and they had an additional social element, and they let you get to places that satellite imagery, because of cloud cover or fires in Indonesia, isn't necessarily going to get to.
Great. So for a little bit of context, the reason why the Learning Links project is focused on girls who have gotten pregnant and are then forced to leave school is because we really wanted to test out the idea with a discrete section of people. So, and we chose that demographic or that group of folks because they were really some of those that are most in need. So in terms of child laborers, would they be in scope or potentials for this? Absolutely. So would ex-combatants, so would children in refugee camps. Actually, anyone who is underserved by an education system and is in close proximity to literate and numerate adults would be within scope.
Sorry, the problem I had with that was child laborers are generally making money as opposed to your demographic. How would you incentivize them using this, because you mentioned micropayments? How would you incentivize the child laborer who is selling something on the street to actually use this application? And where would the funding for that come from? The adaptation that I meant was Got it. At
least I hope I got it. So in terms of incentivizing the child laborer, it really would be a question on how much they make by answering the questions correctly and the future value, or at least their perception of the future value of that versus their current whatever they're making doing. So that's harder to say. We could say they could do it in after hours conceivably. Yeah. So what was the second part? Sorry.
Actually getting the funding or
the
financing.
Funding, right.
Because you mentioned micropayments as an incentive, right?
Right.
I'm assuming that there may be other forms of incentives that you could provide. I don't know what they would be off the top of my head. But if, for instance, we're targeting 10,000 child laborers in a society wherever, and those economic considerations come into play, I understand that. Where would you derive the funding for that? Would you go directly to the government, philanthropy? How would you go about doing that?
Yes. So, donors are, at least for how Kaizen is set up, is actually the first place that we would look. There's all types of CSR, foundation funds, also appealing to individuals, individual donations. In terms of the types of incentives with these, the girls that we're working with, they have an option of getting cash, but they also have an option of getting twice that value in supplies for returning to school. So there are nuances to the whole incentive structure there, and there are many. It's a fascinating element about how to set up an incentive structure for each individual and make it scalable and efficient.
Well, we're at time, so I just want to thank you guys for sharing this with us. Thank you all for being here. If you have any questions or would like to speak with any of us, we'll be up here. If you want to learn about their projects a little bit more, talk to me about HeroX and crowdsourcing, we'll be around for a few minutes. Otherwise, there's some materials on the table out there. Thank you all.